Hi, I'm Rachel, and this is my coverage of the 2018 Sami Rohr Book Prize. The Sami Rohr Book Prize is awarded every year to an emerging Jewish author of fiction or nonfiction, with fiction years being the odd years and nonfiction years being the even years. I've been slowly covering the backlog for the past couple of years, but I thought I'd take a break from that and talk about the most recent award. There are 5 nominees per year, and I end up reading 3 of the books. For 2018, I read 2 books of social history and 1 memoir. When I first picked up the works of history, I thought that they'd have the word settlers in common. But that's not exactly the case when it comes to Jews on the Frontier, Religion and Mobility in 19th Century America by Sari Rohr. The words settler or settlement don't even appear in the index. And her focus turned out to be larger than America's frontier, too. Sari Rohr is an assistant professor of Jewish studies and an associate director of the Perlstein-Lipov Center for Southern Jewish Culture at the College of Charleston. Although her research for this book focused primarily on the South and West of the United States, she did not neglect the East Coast. In fact, my synagogue in Washington, D.C. got a little bit of a mention. Instead of covering a specific location in mid-19th century America, Rohr covers the idea of mobility. In mid-19th century America, Americans were embroiled in the idea of manifest destiny. That's the belief that white people, settlers, are destined to expand across the newly discovered country. Jews were classified legally as white, and they were given unfettered access to the physical United States. This is a huge difference from the collective lives that they and their forebears lived in Europe. In Central and Eastern Europe, Jews were subject to taxes, quotas, and harassment to keep them bound to specific places and specific professions. But in America, the world was wide open to white men as individuals. Problems arose for Judaism as a community. In Europe, religious institutions, including Jewish ones, were controlled by the state. But in the United States, Jews were on their own. Rohr writes about how individual Jews lived their lives, particularly when they expanded into towns where Jewish presence was scant. Intermarriage and assimilation then ran rampant. And occasionally, Jews did run across anti-Semitic state laws, particularly ones that targeted them in their profession as peddlers, which was a big one for Jews. But overall, this whole mobility issue was very positive for Jews, as Rohr states here. In wartime and peacetime, Jews became involved in conversations about mobility and the fate of the expanding American nation. A politics of movement limited by race was further circumscribed on the local level by occupation and time, categories that were not always as neutral or objective as they initially seemed. This was especially clear in the case of Jews, whose economic ties and religious practices were just visible enough to raise the scepter of racial difference. Ultimately, however, these flashpoints were the exceptions that proved the rule. U.S. officials would not purposely restrict Jews' movement, but they would also offer no help in facilitating Jewish life. Jews would have to navigate the vagaries of mobility as well as diverse strategies for coping with them as individuals. 7 years before the Civil War, on the 4th of July, 1854, Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise acknowledged that while many had experienced the pitiable lot of living as a Jew under the oppressive and exceptional laws of European masters, now they were lucky to live in this extensive country, which he described as the largest territory ever governed by one code of laws. In contrast to the German lands and other places where Jewish citizenship was an open question, America's language of manifest destiny seemed to provide an opening for Jewish participation in the great projects of the nation. This image, reinforced by European Jewish press coverage of the United States, lured thousands of migrants across the Atlantic. News stories, emigrants as guidebooks, first-hand accounts, and historical and demographic information in both Hebrew and German emphasized the huge spaces and the far-flung travels of fellow Jews in the United States. I do think that Rohr overstates her mobility thesis a little too often throughout the book, rather than giving her research enough time to breathe on its own. It actually took me a while to find a proper mobility quote with a nice primary source attached to it for this segment. But Rabin also gave me a lot to think about in terms of Jewish American culture, history, and religion. In truth, American Jews were settlers, and they covertly and overtly took part in dismissing or ignoring Native American narratives, as well as violence inherent in this nationalistic cause. But settler also, in essence, meant something different for American Jews too. It meant that they were in a place where they weren't persecuted by the state, and also a place where they had to come up with new expressions of personal and institutional religion. The idea of Jewish culture flourished as well, connecting disparate people through newspapers, and even traveling clergymen sometimes. Most prominently, it connected men through the newly formed independent order of B'nai B'rith, which fits Rabin's mobility narrative very well. B'nai B'rith featured lodges all over the country, and Jewish men could travel freely and always be included as one of the club. It was definitely more of a social than a religious enterprise. But on a religious note, Jewish men marrying out and not attending prayer quorums in high enough numbers meant that the ideas of patrilineal descent and women being included as part of the minyan took root in 19th century Jewish American culture, not 20th or 21st century. American Judaism was always more envelope pushing because it had to be, due to physical realities, as much as, or perhaps contributing to, philosophical rifting between the Orthodox and Reform movements. Thus, the American experiment aided the creation of something very new and very unique for Judaism. The next time that changing geopolitical realities led to substantial changes for worldwide Jewry is undoubtedly in the 20th century with the creation of the State of Israel. Sarah Yael Hirschhorn specifically covers American Jews in the Israeli settler movement. In City on a Hilltop, American Jews and the Israeli settlement movement. What do you know? Hirschhorn is a university research lecturer and Sidney Britchow Fellow in Israel Studies on the Faculty of Oriental Studies and part of the Oxford Center for Hebrew and the Jewish Studies at the University of Oxford. Obviously, Hirschhorn deals with the concept of settlers. It's right there in the title. She chronicles 3 settlements that existed beyond Israel's Green Line. 2 of them still exist today in the West Bank. But her focus is on the self-proclaimed identities and belief systems of the American Jewish immigrants who live there. In popular culture, they're mostly seen as right-wing extremists. Hirschhorn tries to grasp at more nuance, particularly focusing on the civil rights credentials of a certain generation. Back in the 1960s, several of the people that she profiled marched on Washington and the like. They saw the newly expanding Israeli homeland in that vein, freedom for oppressed Jews, especially in the wake of the Holocaust, as comparable to freedom for African Americans. This, of course, often meant erasing or downplaying the Palestinian narrative, though it also meant playing up the historical and spiritual Jewish narrative in the Holy Land. Like Rabin and her thesis on mobility, Hirschhorn stuck close to the idea of liberal values versus political realities. It's kind of more kitsch than nuanced, as I think this example of a family in Efrat explains. The First Intifada even divided Riskin's own family in Efrat. While Riskin pursued dialogue with some, but not all, neighboring Mukhtars and invited them for meetings at his house, he and his wife had one of the few fights in their married life when she strenuously objected to hosting the Palestinian leaders. "We were at war with the Arabs, and I definitely did not want to have them in our home," Victoria argued, but Riskin opposed her viewpoint, asserting, "These are my neighbors. We let Jews in, we have to let Arabs in, and I want my children to see that too." His views notwithstanding, the Intifada still managed to radicalize some members of his home. Riskin's son adopted Meir Kahani's racist platform, including policies on population transfer, openly voicing these positions at the family dinner table, much to his father's deep chagrin. Indeed, Riskin's home emerged as a microcosm of the broader tensions between moderates and extremists in the settlement, as liberal values and settler realities came into sharp contrast. I don't want to criticize Hirschhorn too much because writing about this subject, she's basically walking into a shooting range with a target on her back already. But basically, without all the fancy verbiage, she's saying that families disagree about how to treat Palestinian neighbors. Things particularly came to a head during the First Intifada, when violence boiled over and people were dying on both sides. Other history that Hirschhorn touches upon includes the disparity between what the Israeli government and the American settlers wanted for the settlements. American immigrants were more ideological about their new homes, whereas the Israeli government was thinking more in terms of military strategy. Also, as American Israeli settlers began to be seen as the bad guys by the left, they naturally got defensive and moved politically rightward. I think that one thing that comes out of this study is that most settlers are suburbanites, with strong attachments to their communities. The city on a hilltop refers to a showplace of American ideas and institutions. I couldn't help while reading, but to also view this in a Jewish particular light. The city on a hilltop is a beacon to worldwide Jewry, which says that we're surviving and thriving. Like all signposts, it's too simplistic on its own. It ignores, it erases, it downplays other people and parts of the profiled society. But in terms of rights for a historically persecuted minority, it carries a lot of weight. The American-Israeli focus is perhaps a lopsided view of history. There are other settlers, after all, but these immigrants do make up a disproportionate amount of the settlement movement given their immigration numbers throughout the rest of the country. But this book is an intriguing and psychological study of a certain group of people. And I like that it pushes the needle past viewing the conflict in binary terms. I should wrap this up. My neighbor is playing loud music again, so finally I'll get to the winner of the Sami Rohr Prize and my personal favorite of the three books. It is the memoir If All the Seas Were Ink by Ilana Kirshen. Kirshen is the book reviews editor for Lilith magazine, as well as a writer and editor and translator. She lives with her family in Jerusalem. Kirshen first moved to Jerusalem from the States with her first husband. When that marriage ended in divorce, she found herself physically and emotionally stranded. She was able to get herself up to go running with a friend each morning, and that friend suggested that she should read the Daf Yomi. The Daf Yomi is the practice of reading 1 page of Talmud per day. This process takes around 7.5 years to complete, and all of the participants are synchronized to read the same page every day. It's basically a hyper-vigilant book club with major Jewish overtones, so this book was right up my alley. Kirshen grew up in a relatively religious household, and she also has a literature background. So this book might be a little difficult to grasp without some understanding of Jewish liturgy or of Western canon. But in essence, it's a deeply moving account about how communing with a book can be a sort of therapy. She writes the book roughly in chronological order of living her life and reading a page per day, although she sometimes applies the Talmud's life lessons to parts of her past. This is no polemic, though she certainly buys into the rabbinical experiment that the Talmud entails. The Talmud, from my admittedly limited understanding, is a series of often open-ended arguments made and written down by rabbis living in the first few centuries of the Common Era. Their arguments are about life, the universe, and everything. Kirshen brings these arguments to the 21st century, and to the life lived by a type A, literary and fitness-invested Jewish woman of today. In a tractate that deals with divorce, this is one of the only sections where Kirshen actually doesn't identify with the traditionally male role, but with the traditionally female role. She talks about her relationship with her ex in this segment, though of course she disclaims that this is her own biased opinion of what went down. We biked for hours in the Galilean heat without speaking to each other until we came to a rest stop and ate our pita and egg salad sandwiches. I wrapped up the remaining food in a plastic bag and tied it to the handlebar of my bike. He was bending over to tie his shoes, and he got up and saw the food tied to my bike and said, "Let me check that you did that right." He inspected my handlebars. No, not like that. He furrowed his brow and looked concerned, and though I should have known better, I asked what was bothering him. "You are so impractical, so irresponsible. If I can't trust you to tie our sandwiches securely to your bicycle, how can I possibly trust you with my children?" How could anyone trust me with children? I was so often lost in thought or swept up in flights of fancy. How could I presume to think I was grounded enough to be a mother or even a wife? I felt that Paul was confirming my deepest fears about myself, that I was inadequate in some fundamental and irreparable way. A person shall never instill excessive fear in his house, we are told in Gittin 6b, and in the Talmud the word house is interchangeable with wife. A person should not instill excessive fear in his wife, but already I was terrified that he would leave. Kirschen could get a little defensive, I think, when addressing the issue of sexism in the Talmud. Undoubtedly, the rabbis of the Talmud were dismissive at best about women as a group, and society hindered them from having any sort of agency beyond domestic subservience. The reason why Kirschen is able to relate to the Talmud is because her education aligns more closely to that of an ancient Jewish male. That's why the rabbis are talking to her experience. So I think it's fair as a literary critic to point out that there are at least two different readings of this text. The first is sociological, where we analyze the world and the people living in them from which the Babylonian Talmud came. The second is religious, and it entails an ongoing conversation. After all, that's what the Talmud started, a series of overlapping arguments. Even the physical pages with their multiple layers of text attest to that. The big difference is that in the modern world, more of us can contribute to the debate. I found this memoir to be very moving. Kirschen is like a literary and spiritual mentor of sorts. There was this one quote that I referenced in my Goodreads review, where she comments about how she sees God. And that forced me, for the first time, to confront the myopic way that I see God. It was deep, man. It fortified my belief in my Jewish journey, and my journey with literature. I actually got and read my copy from the library a whiles back. Perhaps I should consider buying it, but the dreaded reread, when there's so much out there that I still have left to read. Alas. Anywho, that about covers it for me now. You can find links to my Goodreads reviews and other pertinent information down below. In the immediate future, I plan to be focusing a little more on fiction, and apparently I've been summoned to a buddy read by Steve Donahue next month. But before the year is out, I plan to have up reviews of the final two Sami Rohr years that I have to cover, 2014 and 2016. Then I'll be caught up, huzzah! In the meantime, thanks for sticking with me, and I'll see you next time.